I think the basic answer to that is I think that what comms professionals and lawyers need to recognize if they actually step back is that they actually share, a common goal, a common objective, which at the end of the day is, to put it in like really simple terms, it's basically acting in the best interests of the client in relation to the particular problem that's in front of them. And you've sort of got to just recognize and respect the fact that the client is paying, both of these different professionals, whether they're internal or external, for their expertise and for their skill and their judgment. They've done this throughout their careers, and it's that expertise and input that the client really wants. And I think what these two respective groups need to recognize is that it's the input that the client needs from them requires that collaboration. It's absolutely essential. They expect that we're going to be bringing understanding of standards and ethical practices and so on and so forth. But it's not really a sort of we're not really up for cooperating with this other group that's involved in this particular project. It's an absolute essential. And I think that in order to really make that happen, what lawyers need to understand, what comms professionals need to understand is, what is this other group actually bringing to the party? And I think that there's a bit of a sort of a lack of understanding of that. I think that's the sort of the gap that exists at the moment. I mean, obviously, what lawyers are actually adding is, a deep understanding of the law and compliance with the law, and also how that sort of feeds into some of the commercial priorities of the client. But equally, comms professionals are really protecting a client's reputation. It's facilitating that client really supporting the public's perception of what it's actually doing in terms of achieving its business objectives, whatever they happen to be. And at the same time, understanding and working in alignment from a commercial perspective. And these are absolutely complementary services, so to speak, that these two sets of professionals are providing. So I think that unless you really understand what it is this other person at the table's bringing to the party, you're not really going to be as effective as you could be in working towards that common objective. And I think that if you want to sort of work as an effective team, you need some pretty early collaboration, early involvement with that other advisor. I actually think that sort of getting involved pretty early in a particular project gives an opportunity to bounce ideas around. It's almost a sort of an early warning system as well. What are those issues that are coming down? This is before we've got to the actual issue or the crisis itself. Let's see what. And obviously, I appreciate I'm speaking to the expert here, but these things are built into some of the plans that clients will have in place. But even before that, what is actually on that person's desk as a sort of a prospect, an issue that might need to be dealt with. I also think that there's an element of a lack of sort of building relationships, proactively going out there and developing these relationships with, lawyers actually building up those relationships with PRs and vice versa.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about, networking and sort of, all of the accountants in the area, all the lawyers in the area, I'm talking about with a view to actually working on projects for clients in the future. And that's not going to be every lawyer that you're coming into contact with. It's going to be lawyers that are operating in particular spaces, but it might, maybe you're a comms professional who's representing big big companies, big PLCs, how many corporate lawyers are you actually mixing with on a day-to-day basis? Maybe there could be more reaching out to those sort of individuals to sort of start building those relationships. I think back to one particular comms professional I worked with on a legal case that went on for 5 years. It went all the way through the court system and ended up in the Supreme Court. And it was a case that received a lot of coverage. But I think when you're in the trenches with somebody like that, you really build up that trust and confidence in their expertise, and they develop huge credibility in your eyes. But what you want to try and do is try and develop that before you've had the sort of 5-year legal case. You need to try and reach out and develop those sorts of personal relationships, those professional relationships, sort of earlier in the process, if at all possible. But I do think that it's gonna depend on the dynamics, isn't it? It's going to depend on what the particular project is that you're actually dealing with. So, what's going on in supporting a client in relation to a merger and acquisition is going to be completely different to the dynamics between the lawyer and the comms expert in relation to, say, a crisis, a dispute, a contentious issue. Maybe you're acting for a high profile individual who's going through a divorce. What's going on in relation to that, or even just in relation to a piece of pure publicity, basically, that a client's working on. The respective sort of input from the different experts is obviously going to be different on a sort of case-by-case basis. I know that we're sort of focusing on crisis in those situations, but that's probably, it's a it depends situation as well. I think this is what communicators are brilliant at doing, is sort of articulating the commercial benefits of putting into action whatever it is that they're particularly proposing in relation to, say, a press release or whatever. As lawyers, you can be quite, I don't know, a bit too focused on the legal issues, frankly, and you can't see the bigger picture necessarily, in terms of some of the commercial issues, some of the reputational issues, and I don't think I would, as far from a client's perspective, I think that probably the perception may be from a comms expert's point of view that lawyers are always closing down particular suggestions and so on. But in my experience, that's not necessarily the case. I often see clients who decide to prioritize commercial, reputational issues over pure legal points. They're prepared to take a legal risk. They're prepared to be called out on certain legal issues because they see the bigger picture. This is the client. But I think our role as advisors is to advise and say, look, these are the different options, these are the different risks. You make the final decision, client. And I think sort of working collaboratively to achieve that gives that client that sort of informed choice, that informed view on how they should be dealing with a particular situation. But I think also, being realistic, comms professionals need to recognize that the world we operate in, there are legal issues in play, like it or not. When you're pulling together a press release, you do need to bear in mind defamation issues. You do need to bear in mind, if you're going to start talking about individuals' data protection points, is there a reporting restriction in place in any given situation? Maybe not in a standard commercial situation, but in a contentious situation, there certainly could be. And what are those issues that are actually sort of going through the lawyer's mind? In a dispute, does the lawyer actually owe any sort of duties to the court? Maybe they do in any sort of given situation. Is there a particular order in a court order that actually applies to a situation? Are the civil procedure rules, the court rules that apply to litigation, are they in play? Maybe they are, maybe they're not in play. But we need to sort of recognize that these issues may exist, and if possible, look for workarounds. I mean, this is what sort of in-house lawyers within the big media organizations are doing, not on an hour-by-hour basis, on a minute-by-minute basis. They are trying to help journalists to get their story out, whatever the story happens to be, but in a legally compliant way and in a way that's going to comply with regulations. So that's the same job that effectively we're doing, when we're dealing with a sort of a general commercial issue. So, if a client is, going through an employment procedure whereby it's sort of laying off some staff, let's just think about some of the sort of the employment law issues that are in play before we say what we're proposing to say in the press release. If there is if there's a merger and acquisition taking place, in terms of what we can say may be governed by certain legal restrictions on these sorts of announcements and so on. So we've got just having that sort of awareness of some of these issues is really important and really helpful. But I think what comms professionals can certainly help lawyers with is just explaining that media landscape. This is not and social media landscape. This is not something that comes naturally to all lawyers. It's not something that is their day-to-day work. It just isn't, and it's that sort of understanding that's really, really important, and that sort of information that can be this deadline that we've been given by this particular journalist, is it a real deadline? Is it a meaningful deadline? There's a right to reply in place. What's actually going on in relation to that right to reply? These are not things that, your standard corporate lawyer is going to be familiar with. Media embargoes, what on earth is that all about? That's not something that the in-house lawyer at a big property company is going to know the first thing about. And so these are bits of sort of value added that are constantly coming in. But again, I do think it's sort of, it's dependent on having those relationships, because that develops that credibility in the eyes of the lawyer or the comms professional about the other person that they're working with on a particular project. It's really important. But I think sort of what I always try to think about is you can have plans in place and you can have thought through some of these issues, but at the end of the day, a crisis is always going to test those human reactions to a particular situation. And a crisis is really going to, whether that's a personal relationship or a business relationship, it's going to really test it in a crisis situation, because people are going to be stressed. They're going to be working against time constraints. And I think particularly in our world, in this particular space, there's also that public scrutiny. It's not happening behind closed doors. People are going to pore over whatever's said and done, and they're going to judge it. I think also in a crisis situation, you've got to respect the fact that people are going to be quite emotional. People are going to say and do things that, with the benefit of hindsight, they might do slightly differently. This is why, and again, I know I'm talking to the expert when I'm talking about these things. It's why having some of these plans and strategies agreed at the outset and in place is really important, because it then tries to sort of mitigate some of those issues. But you've got to recognize that people are people, and they are going to be quite stressed. And there's that famous sort of Mike Tyson quote, isn't there? Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth, and there is something to that. It's how you're going to react and how you're going to, can you stay calm? Can you stay cool? Because that's what the client is really paying you to do. You know, what the client is actually paying you to do is to deliver under those really stressful situations, something which is going to be a really sort of joined up approach to dealing with a particular problem. Um, you know, you've still got to have that unified strategy, basically, with the other professionals that you're working with. You need that coordination, because that's what's going to deliver the outcome for the client at the end of the day. So yeah, I think that crisis situations are going to test you and they're going to put that relationship under pressure. But I think, you know, somebody who's experienced, somebody who has been through these things before, that is what the client's paying for. And that's what you can actually deliver. You can fall back on your experience and you can work collaboratively, I'll get my words out, collaboratively with the other professionals on the particular project. I mean, I think that I know everyone will always say this, but I do think that sort of basic training and learning and just that sort of openness to looking at what people who are working in a slightly different area are actually doing is really important. There's loads of online resources where you can, you know, understand what PRs are working on or lawyers are working on in a particular sector. You know, keep an eye on that. If it's the area that you're working in, keep an eye on it. You know, what sort of courses are there out there? Now, if you're a comms professional and you're having to deal with media and contentious issues, do you have a copy of McNay's Law for Journalists? You know, if you don't, think about getting one because it's going to explain some of these complex legal issues in simple terms, and you might need that resource to explain it to your colleagues in other departments. Um, you know, what what is defamation? What are the defenses that we could actually be relying on when we put this particular statement out? And just having that information can help you to craft and to help you save a hell of a lot of time as well, under pressure. I do think that sort of keeping people in the loop about problems that might be coming down the line is quite a good idea. You know, it might not materialize into a problem, but it might. And they might just be sort of thinking about how things could be dealt with and just buying a little bit of time. You know, the more time that you can have to deal with a situation, the better. Because in the crisis situation, you're going to have very limited time. So just putting things on people's radars is quite a good way of sort of dealing with things. Not necessarily specifics, doesn't need, you know, it obviously needs to comply with any confidentiality obligations that there might be in play. But I do think that's a good idea. You know, you could be thinking about holding statements. You could be thinking about tweaks to those crisis management plans or updating those plans. Do you need to talk to other departments? Do you need to start gathering information on a particular area of the business or activity now? That might be that, you know, it might sort of help you with those things. You know, start planting those trees now. That's what I would say. I would stress that I appreciate that a lot of people who are watching this would be PRs and comms professionals. I would stress that lawyers need support. They do need help from PR professionals in relation to these issues. These are not issues that your average sort of transactional lawyer is going to be familiar with. So there's a huge amount of sort of value added in terms of explaining that to the other professional on a particular project, you know, helping to craft statements. I know you may disagree with this, but if there is a sort of a narrative to be controlled, supporting that. I'm not sure that
I'm going to
you
say, yeah, controlled, but yeah,
man it. Yeah,
managed.
I mean, the lawyers are not going to have the contacts that PRs have. They don't know the journalists that PRs and comms professionals do. They don't know which influencers are most influential in particular areas, micro influencers in particular on particular topics. So I do think that there's a huge amount of help that comms professionals can provide to lawyers in relation to projects.